Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our guests testifying, thank you for being here. To our guests here, thank you for being here as well. One thing that we need to remember is Russia is kind of a paper tiger. So militarily, whenever the United States pushes back on Russia, they're quiet. Whenever Turkey pushes back, frankly, on Russia, they grow quiet. They're good at going up to a brick wall, but obviously stopping when they hit that because they have no ability to make it through. I remember during the initial Crimea situation, I was downstairs on the treadmill watching the news, and I remember seeing I think it was a Ukrainian naval commander that stood and faced down Russian forces, and he said, "The United States is with us." And I remember watching that on the treadmill and getting pretty choked up because I knew what it meant to be America and to be an American, and I was very proud. When we look at the conflicts right now in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, it's important to note that 5 conflicts exist inside these countries, all carrying their own unique problems. They have one distinct common denominator, however, and that is Russia. These conflicts have shown Russia's willingness to use an advanced set of tools to prevent nations that used to be within the Soviet sphere of influence from moving closer to Western institutions. One of the 5 tools developed and deployed by the Kremlin was to hide behind the guise of protecting ethnic Russians across the region. While open hostilities between Russia and Georgia have been going on since the fall of the USSR, it was Putin's distribution of passports to Georgian citizens in 2002 that laid the groundwork for Russian intervention in 2008. We now see the Russian-occupied territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia slowly moving their borders to occupy more Georgian territory. Many ethnic Georgians in these regions have fled for fear of persecution, and some have died given the lack of medical care provided inside these areas. In Ukraine, Russia used, quote, little green men in Crimea and the Donetsk regions. This tactic has allowed the Kremlin to deny any involvement in the invasion and occupation of these territories, even though we know quite better. As a result, nearly 6 million Ukrainians are now living under the control of Russia and their proxies. This may be one of the most pressing foreign policy issues that this subcommittee faces. What happens there is important to the transatlantic relationship and to our national security. Both Ukraine and Georgia have been stalwart allies of the United States since gaining their independence. The continuous provocations by the Russian Federation must be dealt with. While these cases outline the fragile situation Ukraine and Georgia find themselves in, I believe there is a silver lining. Russia intervened in both countries out of fear that freedom and democracy were approaching their doorstep. Both Ukraine and Georgia had expressed interest in increasing their cooperation with the West, especially with NATO. Putin intervened to prevent democratic values from taking hold in the region. However, this tactic drastically failed. Last year, the Ukrainians elected a political outsider who ran on an anti-corruption platform and pledged to push back on Russia's malign influence as president. Mr. Zelensky's had a difficult road ahead of him, and the United States and our European partners must be willing to assist Ukraine in countering the Kremlin. Since Georgia's independence in 1991, we've witnessed the Georgian people march towards democracy and a deeper partnership with the West. Just this weekend, our allies in Georgia proved that while Russia occupies their territory, it would not halt them from their goals of EU and NATO accession. Democracy is not easy. It needs to be cared for, and it needs to be fought for. That's what occurred in Georgia. Following months of negotiations, protests, and violence in the streets, we saw a political compromise rarely seen in established democracies like the United States, let alone a young democracy like Georgia. With the help of the American Embassy in Tbilisi and our new ambassador, Kelly Degnan, we witnessed the ruling Georgian Dream Party agree to transition towards a proportional electoral system. The ruling party willingly gave up some of their power to strengthen and protect their nation's democracy. If this does not demonstrate the Kremlin's failed strategy, I do not know what does. There's still work to be done in Georgia, like ensuring the 2020 parliamentary elections are free from interference and strengthening the business environment to allow Americans and European investment. But our Georgian allies must be commended for their work to defend their democracy. Again, I want to thank the panel for joining us today, and I want to thank the chairman for calling this. We'll have plenty to talk about, and I yield back to the chairman.
To Ranking Member Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to all of you, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Baird, or Ambassador Baird, to add to what you said, you know, it's an honor to serve your country, even if it's a country we disagree with, and to deny those Russian soldiers the honor of serving their country, even if you very much disagree. If I was asked to not admit I was an American in my service to my country, I'd be pretty ticked off, quite honestly. You also mentioned talking about Russian disinformation. You know, I have a Russian-created story about me out there. If you didn't know, I created ISIS with John McCain, actually. And there are people on the internet that believe that. And it's a real problem. You know, the reality is there's always going to be people that want to accept a conclusion that comports to their worldview. The Russians exploit that. And I think it's wrong for any administration ever under any party to deny the seriousness of that undermining any kind of democracy. This is part of the Russian shadow war, the shadow war of misinformation, the shadow war of little green men, because they can say they're not theirs, below the threshold kind of actions, whether it's cyber, whether it's space, whether it's putting people in there under a mercenary, the Wagner group that supposedly are acting independently, but are not. It's a point to note, hundreds of members of the Wagner group were killed by U.S. military a few years ago, and Russia was very quiet after that. Russia, as I said in my opening statement, they go up to a brick wall, and when they hit a brick wall, they back out. Putin's a smart man. He knows this. But he also knows he can push as far as he possibly can. And you look at the situation in the conflict recently with Turkey and how quickly, of course, Russia backed down. The point is, Russia's a paper tiger. They're a power in the region. They're somebody that has to be dealt with. But they exist, and I think it was actually John McCain, my good friend, that said they're basically a gas station. And so you go after their energy. Energy's low. That's hurting Russia. They're going to get desperate. But that's how you do these battles, and you're very clear about what their actions are. So they're very weak. I got to also mention real quickly in Georgia, the violations on the line that are happening are significant, including Russian police or local police in the occupied areas that basically are allowed and given automatic weapons when the agreement says that you can, as a police officer, only have a sidearm. The moving of the border. They understand that a Georgian response is exactly what Russia is trying to provoke. And so it puts Georgia in a tough position of how do we defend our territory but also not provoke a larger Russian response. And that's where American involvement and visits, I've been twice to that part of the area and seen the border, sends a message to Russia and the people behind the line that the U.S. is paying attention, that they are not forgotten, and that there will be consequences to a broader conflict. Let me ask first off, Mr. Baer and Mr. Nix, when we talk about NATO, Ukraine and Georgia and NATO, there's been some resistance all over in the United States, but generally I think the American people are very much in support of this, but there's resistance in Europe. When you have troops in Georgia, Russian troops in Georgia, and they say that's the reason we can't bring them to NATO, all that does is send Russia a lesson that all you have to do is put a few troops in a country and they'll never join NATO. Can you briefly talk about that, and then you, Mr. Nix?
Sure. I mean, I think you, Mr. Kinzinger, you quite aptly put the problem in front of us, which is that when we allow Russia to deny these countries to the opportunity to make their own decisions about their security arrangements simply by occupying part of these countries, we create an incentive for Russia to do that elsewhere where it wants to. And obviously, we have our policy has been since 2008 that NATO is open to membership to Ukraine and Georgia, and that we envision that eventuality. I think, you know, because the conflicts remain unresolved, that is a stumbling block as we talk with Europeans and other NATO allies. I think one other point to make that bears making is to remind everybody that our assistance to Georgia in particular in this case, is not a one-way street. Georgians have sent over 10,000 soldiers over a decade to serve with ISAF in Afghanistan. And so Georgia and Ukraine, and we've done joint trainings with the Ukrainians as well, we do have a security relationship with them, and it is potentially even more two-way street over the long run.
That's right. We need Georgia. If you look at their location in the region, it's either stuff goes through Russia or Iran or Georgia. Georgia, pound for pound, has actually provided more force to Afghanistan than any country except the United States. Mr. Nix.
That's the salient point, that Russian presence has been the biggest barrier to NATO membership for Georgia. Again, the numbers are overwhelming in support. This is what the Georgian people want. You've correctly pointed out that our European friends are more reluctant. There are a couple of ideas percolating, one of which I know you're very well of, and that is to perhaps exempt the occupied territories from the provisions of Article 5. That's been discussed. We've tested it in polling data. There's public support for that, but it's still very tricky in domestic politics in Georgia. That could be seen in some circles as being some sort of concession, and so I don't think you'll see that come up prior to the Georgian parliamentary elections in October. But in the long term, I think it does have some appeal, and it's worth further discussion with our European allies.
Thank you. Time flies when you're asking questions, but not when you're watching other people ask questions. So thank you all. I yield back.